Excellent. Welcome, welcome, welcome to day 2. I'm super excited. Well, I'm always excited when I get a chance to get all of us in the room together. I can't wait until we can do this in person. But for now, we've got lots of people who wouldn't have probably been able to make it in person joining us for chapter performance and benchmarking Unwrapped day 2, using dashboards to tell the chapter story. So we got 90 minutes here to talk, and we've got a breakout scheduled for you. We've got lots of cool content for you. Sarah's got a couple of juicy links that she's going to put in there, so you can go ahead and continue to learn after the fact. So let's kind of go get started, right? So in chat, those of you who were able to join us yesterday, share one quick aha that you had recently. Now, if you weren't here, the reason why I wrote this way is give us just one quick aha you've had. So let's share ahas, because sometimes your aha can be inspiration for someone else, or someone may know a little bit about your aha. So let's share one quick aha that you've had recently. Maybe it was from yesterday. Maybe it's from something that you've picked up lately. Like I just had an aha. I did not know that cherry tea could be so good. So I'm looking forward to having my first cup of cherry tea sometime soon. Anyway, ahas. Anybody put the ahas in? Now, as you are doing that, I want to give us kind of the lay of the land. And I want to mention that once again, today, what we are going to be doing is using lots of opportunities for you guys to be in chat, sharing and building on the content. And please, using reactions. If something resonates, or if you have a question, or if you just want to give love to one of your CRPs in here, let's go ahead and show the love with the reactions. Let's keep the energy up. I mean, I'm going to try, you know that. But if you hear a data point, you hear a thumbs up, go ahead and give us the applause. Now, some of you may know us by now, but it's always worth us just giving a quick shout out to the people that are putting all of this together. Peter and I, of course, are from Mariner. We've got Paige, Sarah, and Mark. And we have Emily, one of the team members over at Billhighway. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. Give a big wave right now. This is the team that is constantly listening to you and wanting to give back to you. So reach out to us if we can do anything else for you. Obviously, that the people, the folks that places where we work, I knew I could say this, are Billhighway and Mariner, and we're really committed to building this community. In fact, that frankly is the reason why we do all this work, is to build that community. So what's ahead today? I love this. The ahas that are coming in. We're going to build on those ahas. Just because we're making resources that could be useful doesn't mean that they are. Doing less better is more effective. A great aha. Constant contact email accounts also allow for event management. These are kinds of cool, tactical, strategic, and big thoughts ahas. Keep them coming in, and we're going to use them today. Through a quick recap, we're going to talk about how do we prepare for the future as we shift our eyes from what did we find in the past, aka benchmarking, to where are we going, and we talk about dashboards. Now, as a matter of fact, we're going to actually talk about how do you get beyond the benchmarking data from yesterday and build a new dashboard. So super excited to jump into the conversation. Just so you understand how we're theming these together, you did J1 if you were able to be with us. Don't worry, that recording is available if you weren't able to be there. That's where we laid out what do we know today. Today, we're going to talk about what do we need to know to get us to the future. That's using dashboards to tell the story. And then tomorrow, we're pulling it all together to actually tell some stories about chapters. So here's my question to you before we get into the meat of the program is, if you tell the story about your chapters, I'd love for you to please share how you do that. Maybe it's a link from your website. Maybe it's a document that you can share with us. We want to build on the way you're telling stories today. We want to build on how do we improve those stories, build those stories, get those stories out into the world tomorrow. So if you have somehow that you're telling a story, maybe it's a really cool page on your website. Maybe it's a flyer, PDF kind of thing that you have. Maybe it's a video. Go ahead throughout this 90 minutes, share it or send it to me by email, because we're going to go ahead and build on those things. So that's a little bit of some thought as we prepare for tomorrow. So just checking into the chat, and I see Sarah's got we had some questions about registration. Sarah's getting them, and Sarah's also giving us a reminder that day one slide deck and recording will be available next week when you will get the full package. All right, guys, who participated? Who was here yesterday? Give me a Zoom reaction. Who was here yesterday? Okay, we got a couple of people here. Some people are trying to figure out if they were here or not. You know, it was a long day ago. It was 24 hours ago. Excellent. So if we got a newbies, don't worry, we're going to catch you up on that. But go ahead and if you've got questions from day one, put them in chat. I've got Peter with me, and I've got Sarah with me, and we can answer any and all questions for you. All right. So what we walked away from day one with was a couple of lessons. Now, these should sound familiar to those that have been around, but let's go through them real quickly. And if you have questions, again, put those in chat. The first cool lesson, I think, I got really excited when I saw this in the data, is that local presence gets a thumbs up, right? That our CEOs, our chapter leaders, and those of in the room, we understand that there's a value for the local presence around building the community, around education, and around advocacy. That's where we then got into some mixed territory, because there were differing perceptions regarding the actual influence, purpose, and value of that. The biggest problem was, though we understood local presence, right? And we understood the value of community education advocacy, we did not define it in measurable terms. And then in the absence of defining it in measurable terms, we didn't have metrics and we didn't have the process in place to track it. Now, some of you did. And some of you found when you began to look at that you could find some real positive stories. It's those stories we're going to build on, as well as figuring out how to get the data to make those stories even burst with more life. One of the big ahas was that the more headquarters support provided did not appear to produce better chapter performance. It did have a relationship to building up that trust, which was very positive, right? And so that doesn't mean you walk away from it, but you do have to ask, and there were several folks in the ahas who mentioned this, you do have to begin to taking a real critical look at where are you applying the resources and figure out how can we measure the success of them individually as well as collectively, so we can make a difference for the volunteers that we care about. The big lesson, and this is part of why we're having the conversation today, is the lack of data. We understand that there is a lot of craziness around this being able to know if somebody's getting the job done versus the sense of the feel, and then you have the blinders on if it's a chapter leader talking or a CEO chapter. And so part of what we need to do is figure out how do we get hold of the data that we need, and how do we create a data system that allows us then to turn that data into points where we can make decisions. Yes, Liesl asked the question on point 3. So it was, we didn't ask how much money people spent. We asked about where you were putting your where you're putting your efforts. And then in taking a look at across the data, we compared that to what ratings folks were giving on the effectiveness of their chapter. And the effectiveness of the chapter was based on some performance metrics like member retention, recruitment, quality of programming, and then some what we would call softer metrics was, works well with the organization, is in alignment, have a shared vision. And what we found was that the level of support over here, there was not an impact to the performance, but there did seem to be some positive connection to that. How do I build up? So we didn't actually talk, we weren't aligning it with dollars. We were aligning it with how much service you were giving. And on the service sheet, you'll see in the chapter benchmarking report, you'll see a long list that we had asked CRPs to tell us, what are they offering? Everything from access to the data via download member lists, those kinds of things, to training, to resources, to web portals, down to the leadership conferences and some other and other kinds of in-persons or more relationship building. And we can talk a little bit more about that if there are additional questions on that. So I think the fifth and final lesson is it's really connected to the lack of data, and that is we need to bring more technology. If we bring more technology to our chapter leaders, it helps in a couple of ways. First of all, it helps solve that lack of data. It gives you some shared data. It gives you an opportunity for you to be able to collectively, we're not talking about you going over here and the data. We're talking about the system having the data and working with the data. But the technology is a way to get to that data, to share that data, to have more transparency about what data you're collecting, how you're collecting it. But the other part is that it alleviates some burden that the chapter leaders felt that they had. And some of that administrative burden was having the impact on them being able to get volunteers. So if we want to address the big ouch that chapter leaders told us about, can't get enough volunteers, then we need to talk about how do we bring technology into it. So what's really interesting about these lessons learned, if I shift ourselves in just a moment, I will, to looking at the future, we find out that none of these lessons are particularly new. In fact, some of the research that's coming out of ASAE predicted, if you will, these. And it's time for us now to act on those predictions and make them in a practical way for our organizations. But as we move from the conversation from yesterday into today's conversation, I want us to take just that personal reflection moment, right? Yesterday at the beginning, we asked you to name and share, if you chose to, name and share a networking goal and a learning goal for this 3-part workshop. And the idea here was, in doing that, you were more likely to be able to achieve it because you share with the collective group and you just mine the collective power and energy and knowledge base here. We're all subject matter experts, right? And so we wanted you to name that. I'm going to give you just a moment based on yesterday's learning and networking goals. Let's go a little deeper into those. What do you need to have them happen? What do you need to make them happen? So what do you need? Do you need to have a conversation with a different organization? Do you need to have a conversation with the Billhighway or a Mariner or a Beth Z, for example, right? Do you need to have a conversation with your CEO? Do you need to have a conversation with your chapter leaders? What do you need to make those happen? So take a moment, look back at those goals. What do we need? Put it in chat. If it's something we can help and the group can help you with, we want to be able to do that. If you weren't here yesterday, then use this time right now. What do you want to get out of it? What's a learning goal? What's a networking goal? Let me give you about 45 seconds. Okay. Thank you, Will, for getting us started. And there's quite a bit of chiming in on that. That's something we should definitely look at for the community. Yes. Some good things to do, and we will return to those. So keep them coming, folks. All right. So the wonderful thing about benchmarking is it tells you where you are in a place of time. Peter's going to draw that connection a little bit more deeply in just a bit here. But part of what we need to do now is to say, where's the future? What does it look like? And then come back and say, how are we going to make the decisions about resources to help this chapters move to the future? Leo said an interesting post, and I think we all have this, right? How do I shift the past leadership views of what needs to be done to align with what needs to be done next? And for many of our organizations, we've got those kinds of volunteers who are so set here, it's tough for us to move them forward. So this next part of the conversation is I want to empower you with some future thinking and allow you then to say, how do I take this and maybe share it with my volunteer leaders? So I'm going to lean heavily into the ASAE Foresight Works. Give me a quick reaction Zoom. Who's heard of the Foresight Works and or seen the Foresight Works? Anybody? When I say Foresight, okay, good. Catherine, Stephen, excellent. Mary, Kelly, okay, good. Wes, okay, good. We got some folks here. All right. I'm going to ask Sarah, can you put that link in there and drop that link into the chat? So guys, I'm on the Foresight Works Advisory Committee, so I'm probably a little bit of a raving fan when it comes to this, but it really has helped me reset my mind around some of the changes and how to have conversations with chapter leaders. So real quickly, the Foresight Works is a deliberate evidence-based research program. It's based on futurist thinking. It is about facilitating environmental scanning, and more than just environmental scanning, it's about how do we plan for change. It is a continual stream of intelligence in the way ASAE is doing it now. They are going to keep a compendium of 50 drivers. They will sunset drivers as they are no longer relevant, and they will add drivers or change drivers in time. They have 6 thematic areas. I think that in terms of what our chapters need to know, there are pieces in each one of these. There are 2 drivers in particular, though, that I want to share with and have a conversation around today, because I feel like we can get to understand volunteers better when we help them see the future in some words and phrases and scenarios that allow them to then say, well, maybe we could change. And I think that the driver that has some of the maybe very actionable sage advice is the latest one. It's one of the latest ones. It's a world reshaped by COVID. It was actually done in 21. We had a conversation in our group. Is this really a driver or is this kind of a report? And it's a little bit of both. Now, ASAE, the Foresight, the whole package, it does cost because this research is costly, and we've got we've brought in some of the best futurists to put this together. But they have package 3, which is the link that is free, including this one, A World Reshaped by COVID. So you can download that free through the link that was sent. If you have any problems with that, just ping me and I'll make sure that you get a copy of this. The reason why I want you to have a copy of this is because so many of the insights in this particular driver help us to do 2 things. Help us, 1, to celebrate where we have come through this, to help our chapters celebrate, and 2, to know that we were successful and we can build on this. In other words, we made changes and they worked. Let's keep changing. And our chapter leaders need to know that they were successful. Our chapter leaders, volunteers, thrive on many small successes. Those are kind of like breadcrumbs that get them to the big goal. And I think it's really important that we take the time to really have the connection point to be able to know those celebrations. Thank you, Anne. So what I want to talk about is this particular driver. One of the key things about this is, okay, so I should back up and say that one of the things it said back in 2020 is that 90% of the scientists said, it's going to become endemic, probably endemic in 22. And that means it's going to continue to cause friction, and it's going to continue to ask us to constantly be a little bit on alert, and nothing is permanent in terms of our planning anymore. But I think that one of the biggest things that they said is that work will not return to its previous state. So telework's going to grow. Yes. Some of you have members for whom telework wasn't and still won't be, but many fields will. And that's going to have effect on career paths, on pay, on business location, on office use. And it's going to have kind of some weird longer term effects. So for example, one of the groups that we manage is the Appraisal Institute DC Metro chapter. Well, one of the things that our DC appraisers, this could really shake some of our profession, because we appraise commercial or residential. And if business locations collapse, if for some reason there's this huge dynamic change in how buildings are used, and by the way, we know there will be, then that's going to change. It's going to have an impact on that profession, which in turn could have an impact on the association. So even if your people are not necessarily teleworking, their customers, their work is being impacted by the fact that teleworking. I personally think that for our chapters, this could be a real bright bulb, because if you don't have people physically in the office as much as they were, or in the workplace as much as they were, we're still social animals. So does that mean that the face-to-face opportunities that chapters can offer in a location that's convenient might become, well, more in demand? Don't know. But this is the kind of conversation that's worth having. The second impact here that I think is really relevant for our chapters is this notion that consumer expectations have been now radically changed, and this is long-term, and it's going to be predicated on demand for more remote services of all kinds. This means it's going to push us in chapters and us in associations to make remote services permanent. I was on an ASAE leadership call, and we talked about the fact that most of us will return to face-to-face large national events, but we will return with a hybrid approach. There's going to be this demand. We need to be respectful of it. And even our chapters have to understand this. Now, how does that translate for the chapter? It's going to translate very differently for different chapters. Some organizations, your folks are going to be the leading, if they're not already, are going to be the leading returners to face-to-face, which is good news, because I may not be able to get the travel approval. I may not feel comfortable to move to a national conference, but I want that connection to the organization. For other groups, though, it's particularly some of the groups we work with that are very large territories, they have found that people weren't really coming to their face-to-face events, came out of the woodwork because they had a virtual. Now we have to figure out, how do we help chapters bridge that and continue to bring those folks? So, two important elements for that. When we look at the supporting trends, I think that the one that, of course, that jumps out to me, there's a bunch of different things here, but you'll see it again, that even the current trajectory, we now have data from major employers that are really talking about the fact that they are not going to require a full return to the workforce. And about 54% of folks whose jobs could be performed remotely are telling the pollsters that that's what they want to do. So again, this could be a door opener for us. I think, though, interestingly, for associations, if I was putting on my national hat for a moment, and if you read this, the fourth bullet down is COVID forcing women from the workforce. There's going to be, when you go to hire your assistant, but I'm going to put it all that you're all able to have, build your staff, so you're going to hire your assistant. Really interesting TED Talk I listened to the other day, or TED Radio Hour I listened to the other day, where they talked about the fact that you have to look at resumes differently because there's going to be gaps. There's going to be gaps from people that were laid off, but from many cases, it's going to be about women. It's going to take us beginning to think differently. So I ask you this question. If our volunteer systems are built on the fact that I get in this seat and I am present to get to the next seat, and I am present to get to the next seat, and I am present to get to the next seat, and the way that I get selected to move along is my presence, and I drop out of the workforce, do I get dinged? I'm back in again. I'm still the smart, ready to move person. So we're going to have to start thinking about, when you say to somebody, when you have a job description that says 5 years experience of X, does it matter if that was over 10 years? You see, this is going to create this. There's going to be a ripple effect to this. But the other part that I want you to see as you're looking at that is, if people are dropping out, how are you keeping them engaged in the association? Maybe at national level, it's difficult, but maybe at the chapter level, they become that wonderful place where people have a soft landing because they're still interested in their profession, even if they're not working it. They still stay connected. They still stay together. And then when you need to activate them back into the workforce, they're there and ready. I just saw, Lauren, I love that pandemic parenting dates on our resume. That is what that's good. And I think this is part of what this is doing is we have to get out of the traditional volunteer model, and we needed to have a wake-up call. And I think this is one of those things where there's going to be this blip, and now we can have good conversations about what does it mean. All right. I think, and one of the interesting things, by having you see all 4 pages, if you've never seen one of these before, you will notice, let me just click back real quickly, because this is the way the drivers are set up. You will have a front page, which gives you a overview. Then you will have supporting trends. And along with the supporting trends, you will have possible variations. Foresight is based on the idea that we see weak signals out there, right? In other words, there's a very faint light in the horizon. Peter and I were not too long ago went down to a family wedding, and we were very fortunate to have a oceanfront room. It was just beautiful. But you could see, when you looked out the window, way out in the horizon, the very distant lights of a cargo ship, right? So it's the weak signal like that. So we understand that as it comes closer, there could be some variations that could change it. And so that's what's really wonderful about how the supporting trends is set up, and how the next thing is in terms of helping people really kind of understand, right? The strategic insights page is the one in which they have gone to back into the association world, and they say, what do you think? What do you think? And what is very relevant to me here are 2 places. The first is that we understand that the nature and economics of in-person meetings, events, and training are permanently altered. It's not just the fact that we've had to rethink social distancing or masks. There's other things, like the question of environmental sustainability. And people are beginning to ask, do I really have to get on the plane to go to that meeting? All of these are going to increasingly complicate considerations. So, and if you're a global organization, it's going to be complicated long past 23, because we are going to continue to have we're going to continue to be dealing with this thing we call COVID. But it's also, once people don't do it the exact same way they did it, and then, so we didn't do that in 2020, and then 2021, we're now building a habit. So it's going to change. It does mean people are going to go face to face. Every bit of information we see, though, is you're going to have to intensify the opportunities for connection, emotion, socialization, and experience. You have to intensify them. You're going to have to get them better. Oh my gosh, what does this mean for our chapters? The chicken dinner meeting may finally be put to death. I'm just saying. We were going to have to really think differently. And then what we're learning right now is that, and in this particular thing, you can read it up there, it says we are talking about the fact that audiences are bifurcating. So you are going to have a cadre of members who say yes to remote, and a cadre who say no way. And if you have chapter leaders, and your chapter leaders on a board say have to get face-to-face, everybody wants face-to-face, you have to help them see that maybe only half of their membership wants to be face-to-face. And then what do you do? What do you do? So these are the things that I think that we have to really help our chapter leaders see the opportunity. So one of the things that the last page of every one of these is to take action. There's a couple of things on this that I really like that I highlight that I think is really valuable for us. So the one is around evaluating your association's value proposition. I think we have to get chapters to really evaluate the value proposition. And I look to the example I looked to, and often someone from AGC on here, but I always look to the AGC chapter story that they shared a year ago at our CEX, in which several of their chapters pivoted from being a focus of education to being a focus on the ground of PPE combined with advocacy. That's the value proposition that is resonant for many of their chapters today. Okay, so how do we have folks do that? And it comes with abandoning the old norms, getting them to think differently and pursue new strengths. Now, here's the cool thing. We've just been doing this. Your chapters have been modifying and experimenting. Have been modifying and experimenting for 18 months. 18 months. So my question to you is, how do we reward and celebrate and then incentivize them to continue exploring? It's a newfound skill for many of them. How do we help them, well, be comfortable in these new clothes? And finally, and this is right here on this driver, this is not from Peggy and Peter and the Billhighway, clarify the association and chapter roles. Clarify. The shift to virtual programming blurred service boundaries. We know that. Set up some competition and some opportunities for cooperation. And we're going to need to do that. So let me pause for a moment. What ahas do you get out of looking at this? I mean, I just tried to highlight where I thought it fit the chapter conversation. Has anybody been thinking about this or using it this way? And any thoughts, any observations? Or did I just put you all to sleep? I'm just catching up on the chat while you guys think. I love it. Any tips for helping the chapter volunteers do their value proposition? Yeah, I've got an idea. And you come back and you say, yeah, each chapter needs to do that. Is there a way that you help your chapters do that? I'm putting her on the spot. Anne knows I tend to do this because she thinks she thinks really, I love you zoom around, and that's because Anne was the exec director at a chapter. So she kind of understand. And if I'm giving too much story, Anne, you can tell me to be quiet. But she sees us from two places. So go, Anne.
Peggy, it's fine. And no, I'm not doing it. You just gave me, such a great idea. So
okay.
We'll get on it next week.
Excellent. Would you? And then you can share. Then you can share something with that. So it occurs to me that one of the ahas that that my board had at PRSA Maryland, the aha came in terms of the value proposition when at the beginning of COVID, we did a series of, simple free lunches. And it was based on what was the issue that was burning. And we just got somebody who would lead it up. And we had two different conversations on the DEI conversation. Now, these are PR folks. They're dealing with this from a firm to client, from an internal stakeholder, and from an external stakeholder viewpoint. It solidified a value proposition around that had been brewing around this idea. It came from the members around this idea of how do we help our members when they are in both a personal and a professional scenario around an issue that doesn't have a clear question, right? And part of this is, and focus specifically on state, because this is a Baltimore-based group. And of course, Baltimore's at the forefront of some of the racial protest and the injustices. But my point is, it occurred when they brought members together to talk. So maybe part of helping boards shift their value proposition is for us to set up some focus groups of their members with them. All right, let's have some, and I don't mean national focus groups. I mean getting some people that don't normally show up, because what PRSA, it was the people who didn't normally show up that showed up and said, why aren't we talking about this? Why don't we have a statement? What's going on? And all of a sudden the board went, well, we didn't know if we could. And besides, we're about education. And they said, no, you're not about education. You're about supporting us. And it was a moment of change there. So I offer that, and good, bad, or indifferent. All right. I have one more driver that I want to walk through very quickly to close off this section. And this is one that we have talked about before, and it's the volunteering driver, right? How many of you, give me a Zoom thumbs up or applaud or whatever. How many of you are familiar with the volunteering driver and or use it? There we go. Anne is. Okay. Anybody else? Stephen is. Good. All right. So you guys, and I'm just going to say this, you guys work with volunteers. This should be something that you have read and memorized. So let's go through it very quickly. It's really interesting because I was talking with Sharon Moss, who is the head of the ASAE Research Foundation. And I said to her, Karen, it is part of that other link. So if you go up there, it's one of those ones. And I saw that Anne had typed that you could get a set for that, the member discount. Go through that. I can send you this front page. I'm allowed to send the front page, but we're supposed to be using it. Yes, good. I said to Sharon, I said, you realize that the volunteering driver is no longer a driver. This is what it should be. I said, it's time for us to revisit this one. I prefaced sharing with you about this volunteer driver with that comment, because this came out in 2019 and it was predicting change that was already, we saw happening. I wrote with Elizabeth Engel, I wrote a paper back in, I think it was 2015, called The Mission Driven Volunteer, in which we had done research and said volunteering is changing. In any case, it is still a very relevant driver because it may describe what is here and now, but it describes it with some urgency. So what you need to know is the future of volunteering is actually very promising for associations that take advantage of the new models, the emerging motivations, the work preferences of their volunteer workforce, and really tap into the power of technology to automate, to improve that experience. Back at the beginning of 21, I think it was, we did a workshop, a webinar for ASAE. The question was, and I think, I'm just trying to figure out, I know Wes, you did an interview with associations now on a similar process, but the question people were saying was, is volunteering dead? Were you were on that one? Give me a thumbs up if you were. Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And we were tapped to find some associations, and Wes was with RAPS at that time, tapped to find associations whose volunteers had not fallen off the wayside, right? What we found out is the associations that were still robust, had good volunteers, were the ones that had embraced the new models, had embraced technology, and were connecting the volunteer work to impact, making a tremendous difference. So what we understand is that volunteering is alive and well. Now, who was here yesterday and heard that the chapter leader said that their number one challenge and frustration was what? But yeah, I'm seeing Karen go, volunteers. Yes. So you need to ask yourself, if we know associations are thriving and they ain't included in our chapters, what's the difference? Well, the difference is in what the volunteer driver tests to us. It gives us a couple of pieces of critical information, including that we have to match members to their ideal volunteer opportunity. Now, that is a more difficult thing maybe to happen at the chapter level, except that one easy way is that we begin to break down big jobs and we begin to incentivize our boards to really, I'm going to say, embrace new generations and underrepresented folks. And I'm saying that we need to help our chapters be able to have conversations with potential volunteers that says, what is your time? What is your interest? What is your skill? What do you want to get out of this? Rather than saying, we need a treasurer. Can you do it? We've got to help our volunteers change, shift the conversation. I think that the other big thing that comes out of that, and it's very much related, is that we have to shrink time and break down tasks. And what do I mean by that? So chapters say to me, well, I don't have enough bandwidth to keep the board satisfied. How do you want me to do a whole bunch of micro volunteers? So I wrote this bubble as shrink time and break down tasks, because it is not just about micro volunteering. It's about saying, what is this job really? What really has to be done? And when does it have to be done? So with PRSA Maryland, for example, we had this idea of the incoming conference team started before the conference, and it was even more than a 12-month. And we then got to the point where we couldn't get a chair. I'm talking on the phone to somebody who I knew would be a great chair. And I said, well, we're trying to find someone who will coordinate putting together the conference. And I need you to do these kinds of things. And I need your focus for about 9 months. And the person said, 9 months? 9 months? And I said, yes. And he said, yes. So it's really about shrinking time and breaking down the tasks, which also happens if you are willing to automate and coordinate volunteer experiences, which makes a huge difference if you're willing to bring technology to your volunteers. So that leads us to, how do we incorporate all of these things in terms of preparing for the future? The first is for us to understand that we have a data desert, and we've talked about this, but it means that we're relying on fragmented systems, that we've got fractured viewpoints. Systems out there aren't really telling us the performance, it's telling us their ability to check off boxes. And that means that we're struggling to figure out really how in the world we can get the services to our chapters in the best possible way. If we use a dashboard, we can help our chapters understand the value of collecting the right data and using it. Whether or not it takes us to share data is one thing, but let's have a dashboard that helps them know what data will be most useful to them. Let's teach them the value of data so that they can be more likely to share data with us. If you show them the power of shared data as part of this dashboard, you will get them on your side. So I know there's a data desert. I know there's lots of different steps. I'm saying a dashboard can help you sell on the concept. We've talked about the volunteer desert. We know they're a precious resource. So let's stop wasting their time on administrative and focus it on mission stuff. And that means we've got to tap resources and tech. And we have to actually build a volunteer development system. So if we think about the dashboard, how can it help us do this? Okay, think about the dashboard. How can it help us do this? We can move from a checklist to outcome tracking, right? And just by doing that, we can shift their mindset of, do I want to spend time doing this? No. Oh, maybe I will go with the technology solution you have. Do you see what I'm saying? We're helping them make those mind shifts. And then by getting them to focus on what matters, you can get them to shift away from spending time on the things that just aren't going to move the needle for them. Now, basically, when we say strategic desert, we're really saying that we just spend way too much of our time in the weeds. We're not talking about and viewing chapters as part of a vibrant ecosystem. Now, I'm going to give, when we turn this over to Peter, he's going to take you through some cool conversations that are going to get specifically at this point. What I'm asking us also to do in the terms of thinking through this is to get the member shoes on. Lead with the member. Don't ever lead with HQ needs you to do this. Don't ever lead with the chapters need us to do that. Lead with the member. When you show the collective impact of chapters on member service and on our missions, when you connect it to the higher calling and a higher cause, it'll make a tremendous difference. All right. We've thrown drivers at you. We've thrown research at you. We've thrown just high level, oh my gosh, wouldn't this be cool thing to you. I'm going to now throw you into a breakout room. What I want to do is give you this time to pause, and I want you to say, how would you like to change what would you like to change in tracking, measuring chapter performance that allows you to move them to the future, right? The world's changed. So we have to change something. We have to start tracking something different. If we don't start tracking something different, we're going to get the same results. So that's my cue for Sarah to put us into some rooms. And I'm going to ask you, when you get into those rooms, say a quick hello and maybe share a quick aha from where you want your chapters to be in the future, and then how are we going to track it. So let's have some good conversation. Sarah, are you ready? Did I give you enough time and enough notice?
Yes, I'm ready.
Excellent.
All right.
All right, guys, go have fun. And did you pause the recording? I wonder who that Carol Blateau is. Ooh, they're coming back in the room. I'm seeing some smiles. That's good news. As we're getting folks back in again, share any ahas in chat, and Peter will get his box queued up and ready to go. So
I mean,
in
everybody
chat,
got cherry tea as part of their break.
I enjoyed mine. Cassandra, what are you drinking there? Something exciting? Good for you. Oh, I just saw somebody's backdrop that had all of the that had like that bike on the background. Did I see that?
Oh, wow. That's pretty
Oh
cool.
my gosh, I love that. Is that a virtual background?
It's actually a picture I took of a street in Montreal.
Oh,
God, that is so cool. I love that. Are you a biker too?
Not so much. I just thought it looked cool.
Yeah, it does look cool. It looks very cool.
okay. I think it is time for us to get back to the program. So welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a great conversation. Please feel free to drop any of your thoughts, ideas, and questions, either from the beginning of the program or as we go along into the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. I know that Peggy and Sarah will be keeping an eye on them while I wander through this section right here, really looking at what are we going to do with this dashboard thing? And we're really looking at a new measurement concept, and we want to get beyond comparing the chapters and typically picking winners and saying who's better than somebody else, and really thinking about focusing on the bright spots. And for those of you who attended the CEX last year, you may remember the conversation around bright spots. But I think as Peggy was saying before, really focusing on collective outcomes, really helping not just the chapters understand that they're part of something bigger, but helping everybody at headquarters and all the other elements of your organization understand that we're all part of an ecosystem, and we can do so much better for the members and the mission if we begin to think of ourselves collectively. Because ultimately, we want to get from something that perhaps looks like this, which is where we find ourselves in many organizations, to something that looks a little more like this, where we're all aligned and focused on the same vision, have the same vision, focused on the same mission. So we want to build a dashboard that shows the impact of chapters individually, so they can sort of do their own little self-analysis, and we can look at them in the context of all the chapters. But more importantly, for the chapters to look at themselves as a team, and as the team as part of a bigger team. It's really an ecosystem of organization teams that are really focused on the mission and the member. And we set up our dashboard. We start by connecting our association's strategic goals to our chapter roles. And I think goals to roles is really important here, because way too often we find our chapters sort of wandering off in different directions, doing things that may be sort of interest, but not necessarily tied directly back to the strategic goals of our association. And those goals typically include things like education and advocacy and growth and whatever else may be floating around in your strategic pillars for your organization. And they vary from association to association. And ultimately, what we want to see is that the strategic plan for the chapter is really a subset of the strategic plan for the organization as a whole, not a separate plan that has its own set of goals and metrics. So part of this process means we need to start with the right KPIs, or key performance indicators. And there are certain attributes to effective KPIs that have been sort of identified and cataloged over the years. And we've talked about these before, but I'm going to run through them very quickly, just so we keep them in the back of our head as we go through the next section of this presentation. And the first, obviously, is that the KPI needs to be valid and reliable. Does it measure what we actually want to measure? And does it do it consistently over time? And one we'll come back to a lot is this notion of it being actionable. Is this something that where I can control this outcome? Because if I don't believe I can have some impact on making this metric move one way or the other, there's not much I can do with it. And quite frankly, I'm not going to try. And then, of course, we need to have a common interpretation. A 10 needs to be a 10, regardless of where you're sitting in the room. And the KPI needs to be accessible and credible. It needs to come from a trustworthy source. And a lot of times there is some skepticism and perhaps some cynicism regarding the numbers that perhaps the chapter leaders see from headquarters. And so the extent to which we can help the chapter leaders understand where those data came from and make them part of that data collection process is going to increase the credibility of the data. And of course, directly tied to that is this notion that the data and the metrics are transparent and they involve a simple calculation, not something so complicated. Somebody's got to spend hours and hire Watson to figure it out for them. So ultimately, what we want to do is create a process for tracking and measuring all these metrics in such a way that we can identify who's performing well and who could be performing better, and how can we take what we've learned from the bright spots and share them with those who are perhaps struggling to find the way that's going to work best for them. But in order for us to do that measurement, we need to have data. We need to have data sources. And as you may recall from yesterday's presentation, there is a little bit of difficulty we have with our data sources. And right now we were looking at what percentage of the associations out there have direct access to the data of their chapter performance. And the number is relatively small, and it's fairly limited to simply, did a member renew or was a member recruited? And it really doesn't get too much into all the other areas of participation and member engagement that are very important for us to accurately assess whether or not the needle is being moved from the member perspective. And of course, if we can't get direct access, we do have an option called sampling. And we've done this with some organizations before where we can't measure everything for everybody, but if we do a sampling of the population, we can get some sense of where the numbers actually are. And I recommend this as an approach when you have a fragmented data system. If you can get a handful of organizations who are willing to play and have a decent data set, if you get their numbers and you sort of put them all together, their numbers probably are representative of the group as a whole and can be very illuminatory, both for yourselves as well as for the other chapter leaders. And then, of course, we typically we rely on reports from chapter leaders. And as we found in the research, and as we found over and over again in our experience working with different clients, chapter leaders have perhaps a myopic, self-serving in many cases view of how things are going with their chapter. And it's not that we want to discount that, it's just we need to understand that that has some limitations with respect to understanding performance in an objective way. So let's talk a little bit about setting up a dashboard. And as I said before, we want to start with the association's strategic goals, and we want to ask ourselves a series of questions here. And you're going to get this slide deck, so you don't have to write all these down in a hurry, unless you want to. But these are important questions in order to understand what's going to be compelling to our audience for this dashboard. And the first, of course, is what roles can and should a chapter play? And this may seem a little bit top down, but this is where I would argue, this is where you want to bring the chapter leaders, you want to bring the stakeholders into the room to talk about what roles should you play and how do those roles link up to the strategic goals of the organization, and really thinking about where does a local presence bring a value to the effort that can't be achieved from headquarters, wherever they may be. And then, of course, we need to look at, what should we measure to accurately assess the effectiveness in achieving those roles. And again, this is where the stakeholders can be equally important in coming to some consensus around that. And if they're part of the design process, they're going to own it and they will pursue it more aggressively than if you just tell them, here's what we're going to do, whether you want it or not. And then, of course, there's that problem of how can we measure it? And the unintended consequence is we tend to manage what is being measured. So if we're measuring the wrong things, then we're going to manage to the wrong things. So we need to make sure we're measuring the things that actually make a difference, count the things that count. And of course, then how should we share those measurements? And typically we do that through a dashboard of some flavor or other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what I'm going to do right now is take you through a little bit of an exercise with the Sampling Association of America, the SAA. And I will apologize to your eyes right from the get-go with this next slide, but you'll understand how it works in just a minute. So we have the Sample Association of America. They sell samples of whatever you need. And they have three strategic pillars on which they're focused, like a lot of associations: education, advocacy, operational strength, and flexibility. And there are primary inputs that help them get there. So in the case of education, seminars, workshops, conferences, publications. In the case of advocacy, letters, calls to legislators, town halls with members, PAC dollars, media placements, influencers, things like that. And then on the operational side, good leadership, staffing systems, financials, legal compliance, all that great stuff. And this is typically where we spend a lot of our time measuring things, but I'm going to argue these are sort of primary inputs. And we really want to be focused on the right side of this chart where we're looking at the intermediate inputs, and which in some cases are outcomes, but participation and satisfaction. And then the ultimate outcomes, CEUs, certifications, graduations, promotions. These are things we can measure that reflect the effectiveness of our education effort. And ideally, and promotions is somebody got a job, they matriculated in their work. That's going to be difficult to measure, but we can certainly count CEUs and graduations and things like that. And in advocacy, we had the passage, the feet of a bill, awareness about the bill, behavior change, those kinds of things, and all that other fun stuff. And then last but not least, recruitment, retention, and market penetration. I'm going to come back to that one last because that's in some respects, it seems like the easiest, but often the toughest metric against which to measure performance. So let's look at selecting chapter roles and KPIs. As I mentioned before, it's important to get feedback from the member and the chapter leaders. And what do they care about? Because what they care about is what they'll do something about. What do they see as achievable? And I'm going to emphasize this over and over again. If they don't see it as achievable, it's not going to be very motivating. And can they see the big picture? And the big picture is important because we want them to understand, as we mentioned before, they're part of a larger organization. It's the collective effort that gets the association to where it wants to go, to fulfilling its mission. So very briefly now, let's go back to our fun eye chart, which tests your ability to differentiate boxes from one another, and look at what we might assign to our chapters. So I'm taking this original chart and saying these are some places that could be potential chapter roles. And obviously the simplest one would be on education. We might want our chapters to do seminars and workshops. Maybe we say we don't want you to do conferences because they compete with the national conference. And we don't want you to do publications because we have a lot of experts that do all that stuff. But we want you guys to be delivering seminars and workshops. And we want you to be part of our grassroots lobbying effort. So you're going to get your members to make those telephone calls, and you're going to have town calls about critical issues. And then obviously you need to run an effective organization, and these are all the metrics inside of that. And the intermediate inputs and outcomes are all relevant to all those things, right? Posts, registrations, volunteering, donations, satisfaction, et cetera. And then the key outcomes that the seminars and workshops are going to generate are going to be CEUs and certifications and potentially graduations. But CEUs and certifications would be the true measurables of the outcomes from the seminars and workshops. In the case of the letters and calls to the legislators and the town halls, the primary outcome is going to be awareness. Primary outcome will be awareness. It may or may not be passage or defeat. We don't know. And then, of course, the viability of the organization is going to help it be more collaborative and really ensure its long-term viability. So that was a mouthful. So I'm going to cut this down to a smaller piece here and take a look at this and see how we could execute against this from a dashboard perspective. So the first thing we want to look at, I'm taking the education pillar and saying, we want our chapters to do seminars and workshops. And we've gotten our chapter leaders to say, yeah, that's what we're going to do. That works for us. We're good at that. We're excited to do that. So what are we going to measure? Well, just because it's easy to count, does it really count? And way too often, what I've seen and what Peggy and I have seen from a headquarters perspective is a tendency to measure things that are easy to count. And it's easy to count how many seminars and workshops somebody had. You can see that on their website. It's easy for them to report. But the problem is, what does that really mean? It just means they had a bunch of seminars and workshops. Did anybody show up? How many showed up? Did they learn anything? Were they happy about the process? So that's where we may want to think differently about what we're counting, because we need to count the things that really count. And of course, do we want to focus on quantity or quality? And this is perhaps one of the most important points I want to make today, because the tendency is to focus on quantity. We used to run the chapter of a national organization quite a few years ago. And when we first started running them, we got it. So they got the Platinum Award every single year we managed them. And the Platinum Award was given to this chapter because they had a checklist of, I don't know, there are probably at least 30 things. And the more things you did, the more points you got. And the more points you got, the higher up the ranking you went. So they would get the top ranking every year. But I would go back to them and say, well, we did all those things, but I don't think we did any of them all that well. Shouldn't we focus on a few things? And you may recall from yesterday's conversation, we talked about chapters tending to do as many as 10 different types of activities over the course of the year and wondering, are they doing them well? And I'm going to argue that we want to focus on quality. And my gut tells me that chapter leaders would rather focus on quality too. So let's take the laundry lists and throw them out and really get our strategic focus on so that we can generate that quality. And then I'm going to make the point as well that we need the right blend of metrics. There's not any single metric that tells us whether we won or did not. And I think it's going to be a combination of metrics looking at registration, satisfaction, CEUs, and certifications, for example, that's going to give us a good sense of to what extent are people are they feeling good about what the process they went through, and to what extent are we getting to those ultimate outcomes that can help us understand we've done a good job educating our workforce so they're well qualified to do the job that they need to do in the economy. So we have all these pieces we're going to measure, but there is one, well, let me back up a second, because we do need to look at what our data sources are. And our data sources, again, could vary. So what do or don't we have direct access to? And a lot of times, if we do not run the registration system for our chapters, for example, we have to depend upon them to give us registration numbers. If we don't do the member surveys, post-activity surveys, we don't have any sense of the satisfaction. We typically do, however, because usually the headquarters organization awards the CEUs and the certifications. We do have a good handle on those two numbers. So the CEUs and certifications, we've got our heads around. I would argue that we want to leverage technology as much as possible so we can get some of those other numbers. And then if we don't have those numbers, should we do some sampling? So as I mentioned before, we could find some associations that really want to play with us, that really want to have a good system in place and say, hey, can you share with us what we are doing? And then we could take that sampling and extrapolate that across the entire system to get some sense of how are we doing as a collective to move this education strategic pillar forward. And then if we need to, we rely on reports. But reports are annoying for chapter leaders because they're saying, oh, here they go again. There's people from headquarters saying they want me to tell them what's going on here. And I don't know what business it is of theirs in the first place. But anyway, I'll fill out this report and I might or might not do it really well. I may or may not have very good data myself with which to do it. And I've got a job, I got a family, I got all other kinds of other things to do besides fill out these expletive deleted reports for headquarters. So ultimately, maybe we need to invest in some technology. And I think it's, the cost of technology has gone down phenomenally and the capability of technology has gone up phenomenally. So I have a hard time not understanding why more organizations have not found a way to put together a common platform on which much of this data can be collected and shared and reported and understood and taken advantage of, because it can teach us so much about what's working and what could be better. So these are critical if we want to understand the impact of our efforts on those intermediate inputs and outcomes and on the ultimate outcomes of, in this case, CEUs and certifications. But what about these metrics? Recruitment, retention, and market penetration. Well, that's a tough one, because in the world of outcomes, there are what we call intervening variables. There are the things we don't control. And as we mentioned before, in order for a metric to be motivating, it needs to be actionable. Do I have control over this outcome? So if I'm a wholly owned subsidiary type chapter, and there are all kinds of things going on that drive membership for my association, I may say, well, I may do a good job here, but if those clowns in headquarters aren't doing their job well, membership could go down the toilet. Recruitment may struggle. The only place where the chapter probably has as close to 100% control of the membership conversation as anywhere would be if they're an independent affiliate, in which case they're collecting their own dues. They're pretty much responsible for people who do or do not sign up for their association. But for the separately incorporated but chartered organizations and for the wholly owned subsidiaries, it may be tough to really assign the impact of their efforts directly to our recruitment and retention numbers, because there's so many other chefs in the kitchen there that are making that stew, as it were. So we need to think about that when we look at that metric. And it may be one that we share with them so they see from a collective perspective how things are going, but we probably don't want to put too much pressure on them to drive that one, because it's probably not something over which they have a lot of control. So the last thing we do once we've decided what metrics we're going to cover is we try to put them into a dashboard. And that's where we need to think about dynamic design. And dynamic design has a number of key elements that need to be employed to ensure that the picture we share is both motivating and illuminating, so it can help people understand what's working, what can be better, and how do I fit into the bigger picture. And so the first thing we take a look at are, what are those goals? What are the goals? We want this dashboard to really focus on the key goals that are, again, actionable. They fit all the KPIs, attributes we talked about before: valid, reliable, actionable, et cetera. But we also want you to think about our audience. And our audience, and we may have a different dashboard for different audiences within our organization. And the chapter leaders may see one thing, the board may see another, the staff may see a third thing. It could vary. In fact, it's probably not a bad idea for the members to see these dashboards, because they are part of the organization, right? They can make or break what happens. And sometimes it's surprising what members might be willing to do if they understood how they fit into the big picture. And of course, we need to look at the visual of the dashboard itself. When you think about when you're driving your car, what's the dashboard telling you? How fast you're going? That's probably the most important thing. Am I moving or am I not moving? Am I going to run out of gas anytime soon? Is my motor overheating? And other things it might tell you, but it's really, am I moving or am I not moving? That's probably the most important thing it's telling you. And your dashboard needs to set that priority in people's minds when they look at it. They need to look at the dashboard and say, oh, I can tell by looking at this what's really important to my organization and therefore should be to me. And then, of course, there are a variety of views. Again, as I mentioned, we could have our different audiences may see a different view depending upon what their needs are within the organization. And then we need to have this data refresh itself on a regular basis. Ideally, it's running in real time. If your systems are all integrated, depending upon how much you rely on external reports, it may be refreshing monthly or even less than that. But ideally, it should be refreshing fairly often. And last but not least, and this may be one of the greatest values that a dashboard can offer, is when there's a perception that I'm underperforming, that it allows me to go, oh, I see I'm underperforming in this particular area. I can click on a link and I can go to some resources that are available in our web portal, in our LMS, in our other resources that I can tap into that will help me figure out how I can make that better. And I think that's a really great way to allow the chapter leaders to own that conversation and to, in essence, self-evaluate in ways that they might not be able to otherwise. So ultimately, this dashboard becomes a way we can have a strategic conversation, not just with the chapter leaders, but also with a C-suite. And ideally have the chapter leaders and the C-suite in that conversation, because as you may recall yesterday, we really had an issue with the extent to which there was perhaps a different view between the C-suite and the chapter leaders about what was working and what could be better. And the CRPs had different views as well. So I think that's a place where getting everybody in the room and saying, here's what we're seeing. If we're all agreeing that a 10 is a 10 and a 5 is a 5 and a 1 is a 1, and we think these are the important things for us to be measuring, how do we fix this in such a way that all we're seeing are 10s? So remember this notion of having that strategic conversation and using the dashboard to drive that conversation in a way that is objective and valid and reliable, rather than relying on anecdotal reports that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of our chapter system and our association. So I just fed you a lot of stuff. We're going to be sharing out the slide deck. We're going to be sharing out a worksheet probably next week as well, and would be happy if anybody wants to connect with Peggy or me in the future and sort of talk through some of these ideas with you. I think this can be really powerful. We have the technology, we have the tools, we have the resources, we have the data, if we're willing to go get it, to really make a difference in how we see our world. And I think what's going to be make the biggest difference for us is being sufficiently adaptive and flexible about our mindset that we can change, because I think the time has come for us to do some significant changing if we're going to make this the best world we can for our chapters. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic back over to my boss, and please feel free to chat. Let us know what you might do tomorrow with the ideas we explored today.
So we already have a really cool super sharing in the chat, and we're not putting Heather on the spot at all. But I mean, I think part of what Heather was saying was, the question came, Peter, is there any software that does this? And I went back and I said, well, it's a decision tree software. It does exist out there. But there's also small and medium ways to make this happen. And someone was talking about, well, we use Smartsheet anyway. And this is where we want you to take this conversation to the people who can make a difference for you. If your organization is using technology to create its dashboards around the strat plan, as Heather suggested, or around any other metrics, go to your IT, go to your CFO, go to other departments and say, how are you tracking? Because it may very well exist. And then you're going to say, hey, how do I use that? It's the same conversation I want you to have with your education department. Many groups have an LMS. And yet our volunteer training, our chapter training is over here by itself, but you've got an LMS, right? So how do you go and have that conversation? So I don't know if Wes is still on, but I'm gonna talk for him.
Wes had to leave. Let me just say this very quickly, Peggy.
Wait a minute, let me just finish the story. So one of the things that Wes did was they were bringing a new LMS in. They were trying to get members to use it, to tap into it. And so what they did was he went to his LMS people and he said, if your learning management system, if you let me build this volunteer 101 and we get it to be free, members will have to come here, they'll have to experience it, then you'll be able to sell and promote to them. And the LMS people said, oh, great idea. So he worked his way into the conversation. Those are the conversations we have to have. Sorry for cutting you off, Peter. There you go.
That's all right. I'm just going to say that if you Google business analytics, you will find dozens, literally, of options for taking data and presenting it in a variety of ways. This is not something the for-profit world has been doing this forever. And it's about time that we got on the train with them, or on the plane, or actually on the SpaceX with them, and began to take advantage of what's out there. And a lot of this stuff, there are free versions of Tableau that you can use. And Tableau is an incredibly powerful data analytics platform. So this is not something that's new, but what I'll reemphasize the importance of, you've got to have the right data to start with, because if your data is crap, garbage in, garbage out. And that's where that conversation with the chapter leaders is so important. Bring everyone recognizing the importance of good data is going to be central to an effective process.
So we'll say this as we close up today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about how to tell the story. And we're talking about how to tell the story, whether you have the data or a dashboard, right? So come on back. We're going to talk about that. But at this point, if you guys have a day, if you've got anything that you're using, share it with us. We'll bring back more conversations on how to make this happen, right? We have, and Sarah put in the chat, and we'll put it in the follow-up materials next week. We've got links to a really powerful dashboard webinar that I think will give you some good food for thought. Heather's jumped off. We'll follow up with Heather, because if she's able to make that conversation with her folks, we want to learn about how she made that conversation. Yes, and Les, absolutely, Lisa Marie, we share the chat, we share the video, we share the slides, and we will share resources. After all this is done, we've got resources and things to share with you, and we will share all of those.
Including the report.
Right. Oh, yes. And you get a link for the full report.
Yeah.
So last thing I want to say, guys, last thing I want to say, and yes, Shelley, you're absolutely right. If you want that chat right now, go onto the chat box, the 3 things. We do not turn off that. Many people turn that off. We do not turn it off because this is a community and we want the community to have it. So you'll see that. Bottom line, tomorrow it's about storytelling. So please join us. And if you've got a story that you've started to tell and you want us to look at it and sort of collectively take it to the next level, great. If you got a story that you brag about, come on here and show us how you did it. At the end of the day, let's just tell the story of the power of our chapters. And with that, I send you off to your day jobs. Let us come back together tomorrow for an awesome conversation around storytelling. As always, it is our pure pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks, everybody.